This is Y376 International Political Economy, December 9, 2008. I'd like to review the three periods that we introduced at the beginning of the course: the Bretton Woods period from 1945 to 71, the interdependence period from 71 to 89, the globalization period from 1989 to the present. These three periods are characterized by different types of international economic governance. During the Bretton Woods period, it was hegemonic governance under the leadership of the U.S. During the interdependence period, the U.S. shared leadership with Western Europe and Japan, mainly through the G8. And in the current period, it's returned somewhat to U.S. Hegemonic leadership, but with greater influence than in the past for not just the G8 countries, but also for the newly emerging countries. Since 1989, these are the major changes: the end of the Cold War, the acceleration of globalization, September 11, and in general, in the ideological front, you have the rise of neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, the shift away from welfare to less generous programs such as workfare, and a stress on empowerment and personal responsibility instead of the rationale of protecting the vulnerable in government social programs and the change of the welfare state. In the subsystems, we have the creation of U.S.-dominated regimes in the North-North subsystem in the Bretton Woods period, followed by the end of fixed exchange rates and challenges to U.S. hegemony in the period of interdependence, followed by, in the globalization period, the expansion of the EU, creation of the euro, and the U.S. re-emerging as hegemonic power with the breakup of the Soviet Empire. In the North-South system, that system is dominated by the bipolar competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. During the Bretton Woods period, we have challenges from the Third World in the form of the new international economic order and OPEC, but at the end of that period, a return to kind of pro-North sentiment in the South with the rise of the Asian tigers and the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, the newly emerging countries, and the spread of the Washington Consensus. In specific regimes, this chart summarizes what happened over the three periods, and I don't think I'm going to summarize this. I'll let you just read it on your own at your leisure. Is there a regime for energy? Obviously not. In OPEC, we have a club or a cartel, but not a regime. A real regime would have to include both consumers and producers. This might be the time to establish one, given that the producers are experiencing very low world oil prices after a huge run-up to the $140 a barrel that we saw in July. So they might be ready for some way of stabilizing oil prices, and consumers might be interested in it as a way to create incentives for the production of alternative energy sources and alternative energy technologies. This slide summarizes the difference between pro and anti-globalization forces on various issues connected with the world economy. The pro-globalization people continue to back free trade in the form of the WTO and the multilateral trade agreements. The anti-globalization people want fair trade and probably would like some paring back of the World Trade Organization. If you're for globalization, you don't want restrictions on multinationals, you don't want restrictions on flows of capital, and you don't necessarily want to add environmental restrictions to trade or investment flows. If you're against globalization, you favor local firms over multinationals, you are not concerned about preserving free flow capital, willing to go back to more restricted flows, and you would be, if you're from the environmental side of the anti-globalization movement, you would be in favor of adding environmental restrictions. Within the people who don't like the current system, there are reformists and radicals. The reformists would like to complete the Doha round, would like more democratic World Bank, IMF, and G8 systems, and don't think the UN system should become the most important international regime, which is sort of the opposite for the radicals. They don't really want to preserve either the World Trade Organization the IMF World Bank System or the G8, and would like the UN to be the main international regime dealing with the world economy. Recently, we see a lot more interest in return to regulation of financial markets because of the global financial crisis that had its origins in the United States. I think in general we're going to see a return to favoring certain types of regulation, including antitrust and competition policies. We're going to see more pro-environmental policies and willingness to tighten environmental regulations, especially with regard to global climate change and toxic waste. And you may see some changes on the intellectual property front to relax intellectual property protection to deal with global problems like AIDS and other global pandemics. Also, because of the recession, there's going to be a big fiscal stimulus, which may allow, despite the fact that we're going further into debt to do this, more spending on education and infrastructure, not just in the United States but elsewhere in the world. There's going to be more focus on the local, less on the global to some degree, although I think this is questionable how far this is going to go. The reason why there's more influence and more focus on the local is because local communities and regions are feeling more vulnerable to the ill effects of globalization. They're confronting less commitment from the national governments to provide aid to local communities, and so there's a kind of tendency to be more active at the local and regional level in order to compensate for the lower effort at the national level. In the third world, this goes double because they never had much of a welfare state or a social safety net, and in some ways the local effects of globalization in the third world are considerably worse than they are in the industrialized world. So what are the issues that both sides have to address? The continued poverty and misery of the fourth world, inability of globalization or localism to overcome forces that lead to domestic violence and war, global climate change, defining the role of local and national governments, along with international governance, institutions, and allowing the global economy to work more or less effectively and to the advantage of people. So who is thinking about these things? Well, obviously our author of The World is Flat, Tom Friedman. He's got a new book, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Saskia Sassen, Suzanne Berger, William Easterly, Hernando de Soto, Joe Stiglitz, and Al Gore. And I'll just talk briefly about each one. So Tom Friedman's new book is called Hot, Flat, and Crowded. In this book, he talks about the need for the U.S. to invest in energy technology, which he calls ET, as opposed to information technology, which was the focus of The World is Flat. Saskia Sassen has written on, she's a sociologist at the University of Chicago, has written about globalization, mainly focusing on cities, and particularly world cities or global cities like New York, London, and Tokyo. She's interested in identifying emerging or emergent social practices and thinks that globalization is shaping that to a great degree. But anyway, you might want to look at her work. Suzanne Berger, who is a political science professor at MIT, has written most recently a book called How We Compete, which is how firms are adapting and how governments are adapting to globalization, mainly in the industrialized countries. But also has written about convergence, that is, the tendency of governments and national systems to become more similar over time because of the pressures from the global economy. She basically argues that that hasn't occurred among the major industrialized countries and has some interesting ideas about why it hasn't occurred. William Easterly is written mainly about the disadvantages of relying on foreign aid. He was formerly employed at the World Bank, and now he's a professor of economics at NYU. You can see a video about him, and his latest book is The White Man's Burden, which is about why foreign aid has done so little good, especially in Africa, which is his area of specialty. Hernando de Soto is a Peruvian economist based in Lima at the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. His main book is The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Triumphs in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. Hernando de Soto focuses very much on why capitalism needs to spread effectively to the third world, and particularly how it can help poor people get out of poverty. And I think it's a very interesting and important message. You may not agree with it, but at least he puts it in an interesting way. Joe Stiglitz, also formerly at the World Bank, but before that an academic economist at Princeton. He also worked in the Clinton administration and the Council of Economic Advisors. And he was at the World Bank during the Asia crisis. He argues that the IMF mismanaged globalization and focuses in his three books, Globalization and Its Discontents, Making Globalization Work, and the most recent book is about what it costs to intervene in Iraq, called The $3 Trillion War. But basically he's a guy, kind of pragmatic economist, somewhat left of center, who is interested in what's really reasonable to do as opposed to what is ideologically correct. Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States, unsuccessful candidate for president in the year 2000, is currently the Chief Executive Officer of a web-based TV system called Current.com, and very much into kind of web business. He also is the writer, producer, and director of An Inconvenient Truth, and has sort of been anointed to sainthood as a defender of the environment and truth teller about global warming and global climate change. Anyway, he's going to continue to figure in the debate on what to do about global climate change. So what comes next? We have to reconcile the global interests in economic growth and environmental protection within international economic regimes. I think that's still up in the air. We have to deal with the growing power of multinational corporations and other transnational actors and make sure that global governance is increasingly rather than decreasingly legitimate. We have to preserve and expand democratic governance in general in the face of the growing vulnerability of the system to disruptions, economic, military, and terrorist.